You saw the numbers, and they're mind-boggling. I don't pretend to be an expert on AIDS, but I did change my whole attitude about AIDS about 10 years ago when I had all these philosophies and these beliefs about AIDS in my mind, and not one of them were accurate. And I got to thinking, because I was challenged on this issue about my belief about AIDS, and I realized, what I believe about AIDS is what somebody told me. So I ended up polyparroting what I heard preachers and friends, and then I realized, where did they come up with all these myths about AIDS? About God's wrath, and you know African getting kinky with monkeys, and you hear all these philosophies, and you go, who? Somebody just made this stuff up. You know, AIDS is a terrible disease, but it's not some curse from God. It rains on the just as well as the unjust. And I had to change my belief system about people suffering with HIV. I used to think, oh, it's all these homosexuals and all that. Do you realize that in Africa, less than 0.1% of people that are infected with HIV are homosexuals? And guess what? That's 70% of all HIV positive people in the world. Because 70% of all HIV positive people in the world live south of the Sahara Desert. And in South Africa, it is the epicenter of the AIDS crisis. There are more people in South Africa living with HIV than anywhere else in the world. Not per capita, sheer numbers. And you got some major countries in the world that have a lot of people. And we live in KwaZulu-Natal, the province, which is the state. And there are more people living with HIV in KwaZulu-Natal than anywhere else in South Africa. So God sent us to the heart of it. And by the way, there's no cure there hasn't been a cure of AIDS. I know you hear these things, and this doctor did this, and this study did. There's no cure for AIDS yet. So you hear all these scientific tests, and there's some breakthroughs, and there's some things that are happening. We're encouraged, but there is no cure for AIDS as we speak. Now, maybe science can come up with a cure one day, and we'll be for it. But it's such a complicated disease because it is a part of your DNA. It's not attached to your DNA, it becomes your DNA. So to destroy the virus, you have to destroy DNA. And if you destroy DNA, you kill a person. So there is no cure for it yet. Maybe science will get there. We're encouraged by what science is doing, but we always got to be aware that science is not God. And when science begins to play God, there are serious consequences. And my beliefs about AIDS has to deal with science. I don't believe, my belief system is this. Science had a part in the creation of AIDS. And if you go research the origin of AIDS, you'll find a lot of controversies out there. And a lot of them center around virology. We take vaccines. I encourage people to take vaccines. They've been tried, they've been studied, they work. But don't let me become a part of the trial of creating it, because that's where the dangers come in. Because most of these things, especially over the years, were created using monkey, kidneys, and how they make these viruses and they attenuate them, and then they put them in us and they say it's safe. Monkeys are sewers for viruses. For example, herpes B simplex. It comes from the rhesus macaque monkey. How did it get from the rhesus macaque into people? Well, you understand that that's how they created these hepatitis, these vaccines. And the only reason I'm saying that is because as the Church of Jesus Christ, we need to study to show ourselves approved. We need to research these things before we start saying that, oh, this stuff came from a curse from God. I'm all for science. But like I said, when science begins to play God, I get scared. For example, with these new stem cell research, we may come up with a cure for cancer one day, but at what expense? We had this, we eradicated polio. Our president had polio, but at what expense? Is it possible that something came through the back door as we were solving this one problem? Did something more vile and deadly come in through the back door? Because you remember, no one even knew what HIV looked like. Until the late 70s, somebody said, look, that's what it is. But how did it get from a chimpanzee into a person? That's when it gets scary. And so the research is out there. There's a lot of controversy. But regardless of what you believe about the origin of AIDS, we are dealing with the consequences of it. So whether somebody got it because they were careless in their sexual behavior, whether they were a heroin user, or whether they just got it through a blood transfusion by accident, regardless of what you believe about the origin, as Christians, we need to help those who've been afflicted with this, because it's just a terrible disease. It's not some curse from God. Because when you look in the face of all these people, and we've done that. You know, we've actually had one of our workers die in Joanna's arms of AIDS. You know, a guy that's working out in our vegetable garden on a Monday, Wednesday he's dead. You say, how does that happen? I can't explain it. But I will say this. I remember when we looked at, of this young man when he died, Swandile. He was a guy from Swaziland. And I remember when he was passing. I mean, right there. I mean, we were panicking because we hadn't gotten him home. We had called his people and said we're going to try to get him home because he's getting ready to die. And I remember he told Joanna, he says, I'm going, I'm ready to go. And Joanna was like, what are you saying? What's this? And he was passing. And I remember Mother Teresa one time said, when I look in the eyes of a person dying of AIDS, I get this eerie feeling that Jesus is looking back at me. And we felt it that night when he passed away. And then we got a hold of his cell phone, and we were encouraged because he had all these. What was the big one that he had on his cell phone before he passed away? About he had a hymn. Was it "How Great Thou Art"? He had texted it to somebody, and I thought, I want to go like that. And so these people are affected; they're dying, and you see the numbers. And all we can say as a church that we are happy for Faith Family Church that you guys have decided that part of your Jerusalem and your uttermost parts of the earth were Africa's orphan generation. Because it is a major responsibility of the church, I believe. When you look at the book of James, and we'll go there. James is, I think the reason James is at the end of the book, because James is not a book for new believers. You know, if you're just recently become a Christian, I don't encourage you to read James. You know, read Galatians. Galatians is a great book for new believers. I tell you why, because Paul explains the Christian life and what it means to live the Christian life. And it's not the Ten Commandments. You know, don't say, I'm a Christian. No one keeps the Ten Commandments. You say, yeah, I do. No, you don't. Look at the Ten Commandments. Say, have you read those? You know, if we have trouble with those 10, can you imagine all the hundreds that are in the Old Testament? Listen, by the time I get to the third one, I'm saying, you know what? I can't even. I wrote a philosophy paper one time, and I began about my philosophy about what I believed, about why I lived the way I. And I started with the Ten Commandments. After I got through the third commandment, I realized I don't even abide by the Ten Commandments, so I got to go somewhere else. And so Christianity, read Galatians, but you get to the book of James. That's not for new believers, because James basically says talk is cheap. You know, a lot of people claim to be Christians. You know, you see it all the time. You people, oh, God bless you, and, you know, I'm a Christian, and I'm a believer. James says that's not enough. Because even the demons themselves believe in God, and they tremble. Read it. He gets in there. If James were a person today, and he was introduced to the church, I would think he would be full of just sarcasm. You know, real, like, I won't say a negative person, but he'd be almost like you see these characters, we were talking about them today, guys like Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, and, you know, you see these guys. Now, they're not Christians, these guys, by any means, but there's something about them that I see James's attitude, because he would come to church, for example, and he would sing the praises, you know, he would give his tithe, and he would pray, he would listen to the sermon, he would take notes. But then he would walk out of the church building and look at everybody and say, is that it? Is that our worship to God? Is that it? This hour and a half, you know, during a whole week, we say, yeah, we're Christians because we went to church, we tithe, we went to Sunday school, and that's it. I think James would say that can't be all. There's got to be more to it. And he addresses this issue in James, the book of James, because remember, he just says, listen, some people say, I will tell you that I'm a Christian, or I will tell you that I have faith. But James says, no, I'm going to show you my faith. That's a little bit different than just basically what people say, I'm going to preach the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. Because there are a number of people who say we do that. We say, we preach the gospel. But then you have this small group. And the reason I say it's small group, because I don't meet very many people. I desire to be like those people. They live the gospel. You understand? Day to day, they live the gospel. And James is saying, listen, show me your faith by your works. Now, as Christians, we don't like that word because it almost falls into this whole works for righteousness, Greek orthodoxy. We get into those categories. We as Christians believe, for by grace are you saved through faith. It's not of works, lest any man should boast. James is saying faith without works is what? So you see these two, they seem to be, at odds with one another, right? How can one person say, for by grace are you saved, and the other guy is saying faith without works is dead? Doesn't it seem like a contradiction of ideas? But what we don't realize is they preach the same message, because in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, we memorize those verses. But why don't we ever add verse 10 to the memory? You say, listen, we're going to memorize Ephesians 2, 8, 9, and 10. Because Paul goes on to say, we have been created unto good works. So he's preaching the same sermon. I'll give you an example. By the way, Paul, what time do we pull the plug? What time do they cut me off? All right, when you start getting up, and I know the Cowboys and the Redskins play today, so we'll be done by that time for sure. I'll give you an example. When I graduated from Trinity Baptist College, it was a non-accredited university. Okay? And I didn't know what that meant until I tried to go to graduate school at the University of North Florida. And when I tried to enroll, they said, oh, well, we noticed that university is not accredited. What does that mean? Well, it's not a member of the Southern Association of Colleges and Universities, and because it's not accredited, we can't recognize your degree. So what are you telling me? You're telling me that it's not valid? Well, it's not valid with us. Ooh. Well, I've got a good GRE score. Sorry. I'm like, wow. They're telling me I got to start over again. If I'm going to go to University of North Florida and get a master's degree, I got to start from scratch. Did I waste 4 years at Bible college? I said, can't be. Can't be. So I said, I need to speak to somebody else. So I spoke to another person. Same thing. So finally I asked the right question. You remember, just because somebody's in authority doesn't mean they have the answer. I discovered that at airports. You find managers of United Airlines, and they tell you one thing. Say, who's been here the longest? Oh, well, she's been here like 30 years. Can I speak to her? She's not a manager, but they're problem solvers. So finally, they gave me a lady who'd been at the university since it opened. And I sat down and talked to her, and I said, I have this degree, but they're saying it's not accredited, and I have to start over. That's right. I said, are there other options? I said, I didn't know this. She said, well, there is an option. You've got to at least validate your degree. I hadn't heard that. What does that mean? Well, you have to somehow make your degree to where it's worth its weight in gold, basically by getting a university to put their stamp of approval on it. Well, how do I do that? Well, it involves some classes, and okay, now I'm listening. I said, well, can this university validate it? And she said, yes, we can validate the degree. Well, how does that happen? Well, anyway. So I start meeting with this lady. And eventually, we have it down to where I'm taking about 36 hours of undergraduate classes to validate my degree. I said, it's still too many. So we're cutting them. She said, well, maybe we'll take these Old and New Testament courses as history. That's fine. Let's cut them. So finally, she looks at me and she says, Bob, the minimum number of hours you need to take for validation of a degree is 12 hours. I said, that's where I want to be. We got it down to 13. So I took 13 credit hours and got my degree validated and went right into master's So I didn't have to start over again. All they were saying to me is what James is saying to every believer. You say you're a Christian. Why am I supposed to believe that? Because you say it? She was telling me, validate your degree and you can get into our graduate program. James is saying, you tell people you're a believer, validate it. And the only way you can validate your Christianity is by what you do, not by what you say. And James here is very specific. If you look at James 1:27, because that's our verse for our whole ministry, is based on that verse alone. Where James is saying that pure religion, now understand the Greek word for religion here is not a set of principles that people follow. This is a Greek word meaning worship. And what James is saying is pure and undefiled worship. Now, we did a lot of worship this morning, right? We sang hymns, praises. If we haven't taken an offering, we will, tithes and offerings. Periodically, we participate in the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. That's a form of worship. Prayers, a form of worship. Reading of Scripture, form of worship. You understand? Those are the common ones. And like I said, James is fine with those. But he's telling us as Christians, there are other forms of worship. And one pure form of worship is to visit the fatherless and widows in their times of affliction. You say, that's worship too? Not only is it worship, it's pure and undefiled worship. But here's the problem with visiting the fatherless and widows. It's hard work. You understand? It's not, what we're doing is not easy. As difficult as you may think our ministry is, we wish it were that easy. We have problems. It's difficult raising these kids. But the fruit, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the end result. See, we was fine. We had all these 4- and 5-year-olds. Oh, it was beautiful. Took pictures. Everybody wanted to take pictures with these babies. And, we're raising money and it's all good. And then they become teenagers. Then all of a sudden, next thing you know, I got a principal calls, this girl stole some stuff from these other kids, and now we got kids stealing. We got this other one talking back and spitting, and we're like, wait a minute. We need to give them all back and just get back some more preschool kids. No, we're going through it now. But we expect that. It's like raising your own kids. It's difficult. It is difficult to visit the fatherless. Because now you go, wait a minute. They don't have a father. Does that mean I become their father? Our kids call me daddy. I didn't tell them to call me daddy. They have grannies because that's who's taking care of them. They have aunties. They call Joanna mommy. They call me daddy. You understand the responsibility. But then I realize, it's difficult. But you know what? It's worship. It is paying homage to God. But it's difficult. You got the other end of the spectrum, because then he says widows. The good thing about widows is not like orphans. Orphans doesn't seem to be sharing the responsibility with anybody else but the church. Now I know we allow governments and welfare and all that stuff to get involved, and we complain they're not doing what they're supposed to in South Africa. That's the biggest criticism. 3.9 million orphans is the government's failing. The government is not doing its responsibility. And I said, wait a minute. Do you understand it's not the government's responsibility? Where's the criticism of the church? My criticism is not with social development. My criticism is with the Church of Jesus Christ. There are 3.9 million orphan children in South Africa, and there are a lot more believers living there. There are all these churches, but how are they engaged in this form of worship? See, the fault in their lack of care and the fact that we have 500,000 families in South Africa where it's child-headed households. Children are taking care of themselves. The reason my wife and I went to South Africa, because we experienced that. We went into a home, it was child-headed. And I'm like, what is this? Little girl, 11 years old, little siblings, 5 and 6, and there's no one taking care of them? Nope. Where's the government? There's 3.9 million. What's the government going to do? Then I realized that's not the right question. Where's the church? Where's the church? And before I started throwing rocks at the church, the Holy Spirit says, wait a minute, slow down, boy. You are the church. Before you throw rocks at it, what are you doing? Whew. Then it became this lack of peace on our lives. I spent years trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. And then when my wife and I committed to go, at the time we thought we were going to start an orphanage. It became a children's village. It became building families, far more than an institution. My wife and I got peace, and then we realized what James was talking about here. But that's ultimate responsibility. The widows, the thing about widows, okay, because we're going to go because see, you have these kids, they lose everything at the beginning. Then you have these widows who lose everything at the end. You understand the dichotomy? The good thing about widows, its primary responsibility to take care of her is her family. So the first thing the church asks is, where are the sons, the daughters, the grandchildren? And then you go and say, listen, shape up. But what happens if they have no one to turn to, if they don't have family that's taken care of, or they refuse to? I'm sorry, church, but it's our responsibility as the church to take care of her. Now, is that easy? No, it's not easy. Because then you see, oh man, I see her yard is overgrown. She needs her grass cut. And if I go there, I'm going to find out she's got a leaky faucet. I'm going to find out her roof's leaking. Let somebody else do it. We say we want pure religion, pure worship. The next time you see somebody out there at a widow's house and they're mowing the grass and they're painting the whatever and they're fixing the car, all they are doing is they're praising Jesus and they're worshiping. Are you following me? This isn't easy to take. James is not an easy guy to take. But he says that's what true worship is. And then he goes on about being unspotted and undefiled. That's hard too, to stay pure. You know, while all the people are committing fornication, they're drunkards, and all of a sudden you're avoiding it. While everybody's on Facebook and they're being negative and they're sending lies and they're sending all this negativity and they're getting all this political stuff and they're saying this guy's the devil and this guy's Antichrist and they're throwing all that venom out. You're saying, praise the Lord, I'm praying for our leaders. I'm praying for Barack Obama. I'm praying for this family. I'm praying for leadership. Don't go there. That's all that I'm not saying. That's what James is saying. You know? This is okay, I think I'm meddling right now. This is pastor's responsibility. I'm just a missionary. So I'm going to move on. But that's what true worship is according to James. Faith without works is dead. And I agree with him. We don't need to have our works to signify that we are believers, but to validate our Christianity, the only way we can validate to a lost and dying world that we are believers is by what we do. I like what Bono, one time he was being interviewed, and I like Bono. I know he's a rock and roll singer, but man, he made this profound statement. He says, I've never had a problem with Jesus Christ in my life. My problem is with Christians. And he's right. Because Christians love as a whole to preach the gospel. But very few of them live the gospel. Because the gospel is being lived when you walk out the door. See, the type of worship that James is talking about is stuff that can only take place outside the church walls. All the other stuff can be taken care of within this hour and a half frame. All the hymn reading, the liturgy, the sermon, the Lord's can all be taking place here. But being undefiled and visiting the fatherless and widows in their times of affliction can only take place once you leave this church. And that's all James is saying. And that's where this church, I'm so happy that you guys have invested. I'm going to tell you one story and then I'm going to close. I can't tell you a story about all of our children. You know, we have 35 living with us right now. We have about 4 or 5 kids that we've reunified with family members who've come into our ministry. And every one of them have great, if I tell you these stories, you'd think I'd make these stories up. I'm going to tell you a story about a Yonder. A Yonder, to me, is the most miraculous story of any of our children. And if you go all the way up to, and listen, we used to have little bios of all of our children, but now that our children can get on the internet, it's just probably not a good idea to put, because listen, our kids have been raped. Our kids have been physically and sexually assaulted and abused. We go to court. They testify against father-in-laws and aunts and uncles, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. And it's an ongoing problem in Africa. You know, if you see a child 5 or 6 years old, there's a you say, well, is that 50? No, it's about a 70 to 75% chance that they've been raped by somebody in their community. And when I think of Yonder, if you go down, and these are just a few, we can start with everyone, but I want to go to Yonder because her story, no, it's A, B, C. I thought Paul was back there. Down, there you go. There you go. Okay, there's a Yonder. Okay, did everybody see a Yonder? No, she's right there in the middle. Everybody see a Yonder? Everybody see her? She loves Jesus. You know, she got saved about 3 years ago. I got to baptize her. And she reads her Bible. It's about discipleship. She reads her Bible. She's at school and she's witnessing to people. I didn't teach her this. I didn't say this is what you have to do to live the Christian life. She found the Lord, and she was so excited, especially as an orphan child. I mean, a literal orphan. See, we've all been orphaned, and we all get adopted into God's family, but to most of us, it doesn't mean as much as it does to a person that's been physically orphaned for real. You understand? Like I have a mother and father, you know, and most of you have had one, and you've lived with them, and so you know what that feels like. She's never known her mother or father, biological mother and father. Because when she was 2 years old, she was brutally raped and left to die. If we tried to find her family today, we couldn't find her because we don't know that prior to her being raped and left in a field to die, nobody knows her life. Nobody knows up to that point. But what we do know is that at some point when she was about 2 years old, somebody raped her, put her in a field to die. Now the Sangoma, and these witch doctors in South Africa, this is where lack of education comes in. They actually preach that if these men will have sexual relationships with virgins, they can eradicate themselves of HIV. The problem with that pagan philosophy is these men know that when kids get a certain age, there's no way they're virgins. So they go after toddlers. You see how pagan this is. You see why the world needs Jesus. But you know, her dying body, and we just have reports of the social workers and what, you know, when they found her and things like that. And we just start trying to piece together. But here she is in a field north of Pietermaritzburg, just a barren field where they left her dead, you know, body to die. But God's providence, that's a powerful thing, God's providence. God says, no, it is not my will that this child die in this state. Because I got plans for this young girl. And she's not going to die here. A police helicopter, doing routine whatever. You know how hard it is to spot something on the ground when you're, 1,000 feet in the air and you're not even looking for it? I've been up in the air trying to look for stuff. I've been trying to find golf courses before when I'm in a plane. I think it's right there, and it's hard. Can you imagine a couple police officers in a helicopter flying over a field and they spot a 2-year-old toddler in some high brush? I can see that conversation now. Here's the helicopter pilot saying, "Hey, turn around." What? I think I saw something. What did you? I don't know. Turn around. They turn around and land that helicopter, and these pilots get out, and they find a 2-year-old toddler who's been raped, and they're dying. They take the toddler to Northdale or Edendale, which is in that area. They fly into Edendale, and they land in their emergency thing because they have a dying toddler. And they give the toddler to the doctors, and the doctors do surgery, and they do the things to save her physically. And now you have this abandoned child in the hospital, and now social development is saying, well, how do we find family? There is no family. And then from there, God begins to orchestrate her life and ends up bringing her to Ndau Yatemba. Boom. Bob and Joanna. And then we find Gogo Mina, who is her grandmother now, and says, would you take this child? And our attitude, and I shared one about our grannies. Listen, our grannies, no one gets paid with our organization. We don't even get a salary. We're missionaries. So everything that deal with our 501c3 public charity that you can read about out there, it just all goes to supporting this whole thing. So here's this granny who says, listen, I'll volunteer. I'll raise other people's children. I've raised mine, and I'm ready to raise other people's children, and I'll take her in as my family, along with 5 other kids. So she takes a Yonder into her home. She lives the gospel, because now that's an act of the gospel. It's not enough to say, believe in Jesus. I'm going to show you Jesus by the way I live. The reason I took you into my family is because this is what Jesus would do. And she begins to raise this young girl into a woman that she is today. And she, during the time that she's she's going to church and she's hearing the sermon being preached and she's hearing about how Jesus loves us and that God is a father to the fatherless. And she says, I want Jesus. So one night her granny brings her to my house. Remember, I don't make our children trust Christ. You know, if I did that, all of our children would be saved. I'd say, hey, every one of them trust. I'll wait for them. We plant the seed. We sow it, but only God gives the increase. And one night her granny comes and brings a Yonder who was about 12 at the time, or 11, 10 at the time. And in about 7:30 at night. And I'm going to close here because understand this is worship. It doesn't feel like worship in the sense of it's worship. So here we are visiting the fatherless. And now she comes into our home, and Gogo Mina, that's Zulu for granny, she says, Daddy, she says, Yonder wants to ask you something. I'll come in, Yonder. She sits down on the sofa, and she says, I want Jesus in my life. That's what it's all about. Yeah, we're feeding, we're sheltering them, we're educating them, but without Jesus, it's nothing. It's futile. And here we are, she's coming to my door. And so I sit down with the Yonder and I lead her to Jesus Christ. And she's no longer an orphan. She becomes a child of the living God. But he orchestrated all of this. And so, church, this is the investment. You send, we go. This, my friend, is the fruit. So thank you. Thank you, Paul and Judy. Thank you, church. Oh, I can go on and on about her. I mean, she loves the Lord. She loves the Lord in spite of my shortcomings and Joanna's shortcomings. If she were here right now, you'd say, who is this girl? She is madly and passionately in love with Jesus Christ. She doesn't say, oh, I got to teach Sunday school. She says, can I teach Sunday school? And she's up there with the music and she's teaching lessons and she's got the other kids excited about helping her teach. And it's a thing of beauty. Yes, is it tough? Was it tough trying to raise money to go to South Africa to quit our jobs? Oh, yeah, I guess so. I guess it is. But when you see that fruit falling off the tree and you get to take a bite of it, you say, oh, praise God, this is some good fruit. But you know what? Just like any good fruit, it didn't come easy. That fruit was hard. But my friend, it's worth it. So when you go out from the church today, remember, living the Christian life is difficult. This is easy today, to come to Sunday school, to have some tea, and to listen to Brother Paul and go to church. It's great. Understand, it's important. But to live the gospel pure and undefiled worship before God can only take place once you leave the doors of this church. And I challenge you, church, where you work, where you go, live the gospel. Nobody should, one of the most terrible, and Brother Paul, if you can come, the worst question that somebody can ever ask you or say to you, the worst statement ever, think about this. You've known somebody, been working with somebody for years. months, whatever. The worst thing that can ever be said to you as a believer is, I didn't know you were a believer. I didn't know you were a believer. Never let that be said of any of us in here. That doesn't mean we're perfect, but let's live the gospel, not by what we say, but by what we do. And you know what people will do? Whatever you have, I want that. And Yonder saw it in the lives of her granny. She saw it in us. She saw it in the people at church. I want that. And we gave it to her. And his name was Jesus. Thank you, Paul.